Read enough books and something happens. You develop preferences, which in turn make you love the books you read all the more. However, in developing your tastes, you also learn something else, what you don't like. As bookworms, we wish we could love every book we read. For my part, I like the majority of the books I read, but do I always love them? While it's rare for me to DNF a book or stop reading one, this isn't to say I don't have my nitpicks. The more we read, the more we realize what works for us and what doesn't. Sometimes it comes down to your personal taste, and other times it's poor writing. But whatever the case, we can all say what we like or don't like. Often I can overlook these complaints if I'm otherwise enjoying the story. I might simply give a book a lower rating, but still finish it. Other people, though, are more discerning than I am, and that's valid. Forcing yourself to finish something which is bothering you will only lead to a reading slump, or take time away from a book you could be loving. Forgiving as I am, I have a number of personal pet peeves as a bookworm. Before we continue, I'm Riley, and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I rant about fantasy books, discuss characters and lore, offer my bookish opinion, and share the occasional writing advice. If any of that sounds like your cup of tea, hit that subscribe button. Posts are on Fridays. I'm fairly laid back when it comes to the books I read. The majority of the novels I consume earn at least a 4-star rating, with 5-star ratings being reserved for my favorites. And even the books which disappoint me typically earn 3.5 stars if I still had fun reading them. That said, here are the 4 things which bother me when I'm reading. Number 1. Sped up pacing. I'll be the first to admit this is a personal preference. While bad pacing can be a sign of poor writing, the range at which books can be paced varies drastically, and for my part, I tend to prefer a slower burn. For some people, many in fact, slower books can become tedious or boring, but I appreciate the extra time to get to know characters, explore world building, and visualize the world through the author's description. 2 book series which went too quickly for me in some chapters were The Witcher and Percy Jackson. Again, I think this is a personal thing, but there were scenarios in The Witcher I wanted to see explored further. When it came to Ciri developing her relationship with Yennefer, I loved it. I just wanted to see more. What felt like 2 chapters later, the pair had a familial bond, and I would have liked a few more interactions between the two to solidify it. As for the Percy Jackson series, I acknowledge that it's middle grade, and that children's stories in general are going to be faster paced. However, I grew up on the Harry Potter series, and many of those books, especially the later ones, are chunky. If I want a book to be longer, that's not a bad complaint to have. I loved seeing the relationships unfold between Percy and his friends, especially when it came to Percy's almost love triangle with Annabeth and Rachel Elizabeth Dare. But I wanted more. In comparison, the Harry Potter books feel perfectly paced to me, which is interesting because many people found the 7th had too much camping. Call me a weirdo, but I liked the camping. I liked seeing Hermione process her grief when Ron left the group. I loved seeing the dynamics within the Golden Trio shift as they struggled. Left to survive, there was a lot more room for interpersonal conflict. And I'm a sucker for character drama, regardless of the genre. In the Percy Jackson books, Annabeth would be annoyed with Percy for a couple chapters. But in Harry Potter, a feud between characters might last for a third of the book or more. The quarreling between Ron and Hermione especially happened over several books, going beyond name-calling and progressing to outright separation between the two. It's a nitpick, but I wanted more downtime in the Percy Jackson books, where Percy and Annabeth could interact. This all goes back to my personal preference for what I call downtime, in which the story pauses and allows the characters to relax and otherwise get to know each other. For comparison, the books I do find perfectly paced include the works of Anne Rice and Sarah J. Maas, two authors known for writing long stories. Both of their styles are quite different, but both authors tend to flesh out their characters more, world build extensively, and otherwise give their characters time outside the plot to just hang out with each other. Now, most people would find The Witching Hour, for example, to be overly long. And at 900 plus pages with tiny writing, it certainly isn't a short read. However, I never come away from an Anne Rice book complaining about flat characters or white room syndrome. Others have also found the ACOTAR books boring, but some of my favorite scenes included Feyre getting to know her found family. If I don't have time to get to know the characters, I'm not going to care how high their stakes are. Number 2. Sappy dialogue. This may come down to another personal preference, especially when it comes to books with a romance plot. But I can't help cringing when all the characters in a story start giving each other sage advice, especially when they're so inept in their own relationships. I can see one character being perceptive, but having all the characters be wise beyond their years, especially if they're only teenagers, doesn't ring true for me. That said, I call this a personal preference because I know other people love it. You see dramatic book quotes on TikTok all the time, of characters declaring their feelings or delivering a poignant metaphor. I know romance can get a bad rep, and I've met people who can't stand it. And the primary reason for this may be a lack of realism, especially when it comes to dialogue. I understand that there's a certain suspension of disbelief required. I love much of what annoys others, such as love triangles, everyone being paired off, the quirky love interest, and so on. However, cheesy dialogue takes me out of the story, not only because it's unrealistic, but because all of the characters can start to sound the same. Whatever your genre, your characters should feel distinct from one another. And when everyone is wise and metaphorical, it can start to feel like the author is talking instead. You lose the tension of the story, along with the unique voices of the characters. For this reason, I gave the latest Cassandra Clare book a lower review than previous titles in her Shadowhunter series. Everyone seemed too smart when giving advice to their friends, but when it came to their own relationships, they blundered. When Aradne told Anna she was like a diamond, it just felt too, bookish. If you were fighting with your girlfriend, would you start pulling out the metaphors? It makes sense if the character is an awkward bookworm type, but everybody was doling out the advice, despite the fact that, in their own romantic pursuits, they were awful at communication. Pair the cheesy dialogue with the miscommunication trope, and it's beyond exasperating. As an aside, if you're still watching, be sure to give this video a like so that others can enjoy it. Number 3. Everyone acting like it's the 2020s. I'm not trying to pick on Cassandra Clare here, but this nitpick also applies to her latest series, The Last Hours. In fact, this is something I've noticed in several stories, be it video games or books. The desire to write a story which takes place in the past is greater than ever. The 1800s, in particular, are an era people seem drawn to. One only needs to look at the popularity of Jane Austen retellings or Bridgerton to see this in action. The problem happens when, hoping to appease a modern audience, the writer makes their characters modern too. Despite living in the 1800s, characters in these types of stories will think and behave as if they jumped out of a time machine from our times. Now, am I saying heroes from the 1800s should be raging homophobes or obedient wives? No. Gay people have always existed, and there have always been people who believed in equal rights. In the 1800s, there were plenty of women who believed women should have equal rights to men, that women could be just as intelligent or productive if given the chance. Many of Austen's own heroines were progressive for their time. That said, the problem comes when all characters behave as if it's the 2020s. If your story takes place in a fictional universe unrelated to Earth, or the organization detailed in your story is noted for being unusually forward-thinking, you have some leeway. Moreover, stories written in the 1800s can have independent female thinkers, gay couples, and so on, though the people around them aren't necessarily going to be as accepting as those living in modern times. If we use Jane Austen as an example, many people did look askance at Elizabeth. When she pursued a man wealthier than herself, or hiked across the country without a carriage and muddied her dress, other characters judged her. Other women even accused her of being too independent, and her family was subject to a great deal of scrutiny for not conforming to norms. Those closest to Elizabeth still loved and accepted her, but several characters, including her beloved Darcy, didn't fail to notice her peculiarities, or those of her sisters. Darcy even interfered with Jane's attachment to Bingley when the Bennets acted too much outside propriety. In Cassandra Clare's series, everyone seems to be pro-gay, or a majority do, and that doesn't feel realistic. I'm not saying I want to see homophobia, but life sometimes feels too easy for the characters. The fact that Cordelia was so independent should have earned more looks too. After all, even the books themselves note that women, even Shadowhunter women, are expected to marry and start families. In fairness, Ariadne's struggle feels fairly realistic. Her mother more or less throws her out of the house for her sexuality. But her mother is painted as an ignorant fool in a society where her reaction would have been seen as normal. Charles also betrayed concern over what others would think. He's blackmailed for his secret. But when he comes clean, the fallout seems negligible. The book almost makes Charles seem like he's overreacting, when in reality, his fears would be very real for the time. Some novels get around this by branding themselves as alternate histories, but just as many don't bother. This can be even more glaring when stories within the same series, which take place later, show a less progressive world. When Alec came out in the Mortal Instrument series, he struggled. He barely confessed to Jace, let alone others. By comparison, Anna, Alistair, and Matthew are relaxed, despite the fact their stories take place more than 100 years ago. If Claire had made Shadowhunter society super progressive, I'd be all for it. But the majority of the books reveal the Clave to be anything but. The Clave of the early 2000s didn't make Alec feel accepted, and yet Anna and Matthew suffer no more than a few funny looks. It comes down to consistency. Either a writer should make their world progressive or prejudiced. Otherwise, it can feel like the author is trying to have their cake and eat it too. Given the wide acceptance by the Clave of Anna and Alistair, Alec's later discomfort makes no sense. Sometimes society can go backwards, but in 100 years, the Clave's attitude should have improved rather than worsened. Beliefs aside, characters from the 1800s can sound and act too modern too. Women run about without chaperones. Characters share their sexual preferences, and everyone talks like a Gen Z. I have no problem with characters breaking convention. All I'm saying is that it feels unrealistic when other characters don't bat an eye. Elizabeth Bennet still feels relatable to readers today, but her world feels realistic too, because her unconventional behavior does pose an obstacle. Elizabeth's modern attitudes do earn her ire from her fellows, and her life is complicated by the judgment of others. However, conflict only makes a story better, and having your character struggle because of prejudice actually strengthens the story by providing the reader with drama and stakes. Ironically, even Hogwarts Legacy has received some criticism on this end, with some pointing out that the acceptance of a non-binary fifth year or a lesbian woman by the wider populace feels odd. While it's great that wizards are so progressive, never questioning Sirona, a transgender bartender, it presents a plot hole when Dumbledore conceals his own sexuality later. If Sirona didn't cause a stir, what reason did Dumbledore have to hide? Hogwarts Legacy isn't a book, but it serves as a good example of something I've come across in current novels. By all means, have a progressive hero. Just make sure you explain why. If there's an in-universe reason your core cast is so forward-thinking, provide it. If there isn't, show other characters reacting accordingly. Otherwise, it feels like reading a 2020 story in an 1800s skin, rather than a story that actually takes place in the 1800s, which, for me, is as immersion-breaking as bad dialogue. I don't want to feel like I'm reading a book. I want to lose myself into story and believe in it. When all of your characters act like Gen Zs and millennials, I feel like A, I'm reading a book, and B, the author wants me to learn a lesson rather than lose myself in the world. Themes are great, but make it make sense. Number 4, exposition. While some of these other nitpicks were more personal, I think most of us can agree that exposition is annoying. Much as I love young adult books, the genre seems particularly prone to a need to over-explain. I can be forgiving of exposition to a degree in a middle grade novel, but assuming that teenagers can't read between the lines doesn't show much faith in their intelligence. If you've come across any writing advice, you've probably heard the adage, show, don't tell. A little telling is acceptable. If you want to keep your story moving, it's even necessary. That said, if something can be shown as quickly as it can be told, then showing is the route to go. Opening with a chapter explaining everything is not only boring, but confusing. The more information you throw at readers, the more you overwhelm them. If a book says Tom felt scared, instead of describing Tom as shaking or whimpering, the story has less impact. Of course, there will always be exceptions. When it comes to exposition, opening with a character's backstory is considered a major no-no. However, Anne Rice regularly pauses her stories to share character backstories, even near the beginning of her books. Some writers can pull this off, making exposition interesting and relevant to the story, but most fail when they try to break this rule, and the result is a book that's too slow, or whose characters feel flat because they never actually show their personalities in action. As a reader, I want to experience a story, not feel like I'm reading a bullet point list of events. In conclusion, reading is subjective, and what I dislike might be what others love, or vice versa. A friend of mine hates slow burn romance, while I actually prefer it. Many prefer a fast-paced and action-packed book, while I love a book which is character-oriented and willing to take its time. When it comes to reading, I'm easygoing. I seldom abandon a book, and the majority of the stories I read earn at least 4 stars. Even those which have disappointed me on some level usually earn 3.5 stars by excelling in other areas. And as a writer, I know how difficult it can be to write a perfect book. In fact, a perfect book is a myth, even among 5-star reads. That said, as a bookworm, I've come to develop my own pet peeves, be it unrealistic dialogue, an unconvincing representation of an earlier time period, exposition, or a story that moves too quickly. These have been my 4 nitpicks. What are your personal pet peeves as a reader? Do your preferences differ from mine? Do you ever abandon books? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and happy reading.